All right, finally we can get this thing underway. So after having taken another detour last week to talk with you about the anniversary of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, I want to return to this continuing theme of justice, care, ethics, and the lifespan revolution, and begin to do a little bit of transitioning today. So far, I think the emphasis has been primarily on ethics and the lifespan revolution in the sense of what we need to think about a complete human life as we live longer, and how it is that our received categories and stereotypes with regards to age are hindering us from thinking clearly about the value available to us in the later phases of life. But I want also to extend this into the terrain of justice and eventually politics and policy as well. And so I feel like we've laid some of the groundwork for that. And I will come back to some more philosophical themes because I think they're also relevant to the political and policy questions. But it will be much more as we make this transition about what we should do about the crisis of care and the lifespan revolution as matters of policy and justice in America in the middle of the 21st century. So that's where we're headed. Um, Very quickly, just to refresh your memory as to where we've been, right? We started with a San Francisco native, Luis Aronson, professor of geriatrics at University of California, San Francisco, who in her book on elderhood, which covers a tremendous diversity of topics, is very rich, very interesting, in many ways, a memoir, but also a manifesto for healthcare reform. She argues that in general, the medicalization of the human body is a constricting lens with which to make health decisions, and that in particular, the medicalization of aging has given us a disease model, has led us to simplify, to stereotype, to misunderstand, and has transferred agency out of the hands of individuals themselves and into medical experts, and that this is inhibiting people maintaining agency, making good decisions, having greater control, and having greater satisfaction and well-being in their elderhood. And so a doctor blaming medicine, not that surprising, I suppose, but that's the first big perspective we've looked at. The second was opened by Daniel Levitin, also a Bay Area native, son of Moraga, California, and a neuroscientist, professor at the University of McGill, and also a popularizer, a synthesizer of neuroscience. So someone who writes best-selling New York Times books, not just technical journal articles. And the book I'm focusing on, obviously, Successful Aging, is about the fact that the brain, contrary to stereotype, does not uniformly or necessarily or even perhaps at all decline as part of the aging process. There are aspects of cognitive functioning that do suffer impairment to varying degrees for different people in our society as they enter their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 100s, right? But having said that, there are other aspects of cognition that actually improve and strengthen, and some aspects that don't suffer at all. And so we're not treating ourselves accurately or fairly if we think of aging as simply mental decline. And in fact, he suggests engaging in lifelong learning, challenging yourself not just to do puzzles, but to learn genuinely new and unfamiliar things, develops late life neurological health. Then I turned to a couple psychologists, Ellen Langer and Becca Levy. Levy's work we're mainly still getting acquainted with, and I'll say more about it today. But it's an interesting pairing, as you may be able to see from their images. They represent kind of succeeding generations of American psychology. Langer at Harvard, as I've mentioned, was one of the founders of the mindfulness movement in American culture more generally, and concentrated a lot of her very innovative research in the 70s and 80s and 90s on the idea of having a positive attitude to aging and what it can do to you in terms not only of your psychological well-being, but in terms of its actual benefits for your physical health. One of her students, Becca Levy, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, actually co-authored with Ellen Langer some very influential articles describing some experiments they did in laboratories and in the community as a whole. And Levy has gone on to become a very influential social psychologist. She teaches at Yale, where she's a professor of psychology, but also a professor in the public health school at Yale of epidemiology. And I'll say a little bit more about why she wears those two hats, despite being a psychologist by training. And so let me then start jumping us into Levy's work. And the book here is called Breaking the Age Code. And it's another of these synthetic texts written by someone, and Levy has over 200 published articles in psychology. Much of this work is done on teams. She heads a center that studies the psychology of aging at Yale. And so many of these are co-authored in rather technical articles, but her book describes the overall findings in less technical terms and synthesizes the last 20 years of scholarship she's done. So to begin with, Levy is just building on a body of literature that we've looked at together in other contexts before, for instance, with regards to race. We'll talk a little bit more about it with regards to gender in the context of these talks that we're doing together. But this idea that stereotypes are not just explicitly prejudiced attitudes, but very often implicit and unconscious ways of categorizing the social world that do not even have to be explicitly taught in order to be internalized. We naturally assimilate them from the cultural cues in our environment, things as subtle as minor adjustments in facial expression or body carriage teach young children who is admired or respected or cared for or feared or pitied or despised by their parents. Their parents may not even be aware that they have those attitudes, right? Again, this is the idea of unconscious and implicit bias, that it's been transmitted generation to generation. It's there in the media, it's there in images all around us. And the way she puts it in the realm of age beliefs, and so this is a category that she has really done the pioneering research on in implicit bias theory, in the way that Jennifer Eberhardt has done the pioneering research with regards to race. Claude Steele, I guess, would be added to that short list as well. Age beliefs with their associated expectations are so powerful, they define how we experience aging. And so One way to express this idea is that our experience of ourselves is mediated by our self-conceptions, that our self-conceptions are not things that we are completely at liberty to generate in any which way we choose, but instead they reflect the concepts and the social categorizations and classifications available to us in our society, and that when we live in a society that tends to associate aging with decline, with incapacity, with, and then we could continue the list of stereotypes: feeble-mindedness, stubbornness, conservativeness, right? That self-neglect, right? That those ideas get inside us, even if our explicit attitude about the self is very different. And once they're there, they strongly influence us. And one of the, I think, really important things that Becca Levy has done is to try to really pin down the mechanisms, the pathways via which those implicit biases come to change our experience of aging, as well as our physical capacity and health. The next thing to notice is that implicit bias in many ways reproduces itself autonomously culturally, right? So it gets transmitted from parent to child matures, passes it along to their next generation if they have children. Having said that, none of those people may actually be aware that they are participating in the reproduction of implicit bias. It's part of the shared assumptions of cultural categorization. And one of the things that makes it so hard to counteract, you can think here, Jennifer Eberhardt, on implicit bias, the association of African American male with a threat, is one of the reasons it's been so hard to break that stereotype is because it's not a conscious idea. Our conscious ideas may very much contradict the content of our implicit social categorizations, and they continue to be reproduced over time. But having said that, it's also important to recognize that we often structure the world in accord with our social categorizations, including our implicit biases, right? And so we have studied together before the way in which segregation, residential housing segregation in places like Oakland, California, was not just aided and abetted by the federal government through policies like redlining, but also actively produced and enforced by the federal government in places like Richmond and Palo Alto, where they made it a precondition of building federal housing, providing federal mortgage assistance, using FHA, Federal Housing Authority funds to construct housing, that the housing be segregated, that the neighborhoods be distinct, right? And then we live in a segregated world. We live in a world where, when we look at areas in Oakland and Richmond and East Palo Alto and the Tenderloin in San Francisco that are dominantly Black, they're also often high concentration of poverty as well, higher rates of crime, or at least so we perceive. And so when the world is structured in a way that reflects the implicit bias gets all the harder to break. The structure of the world and the structure of our social categories reinforce each other. And it's not accidental, right? The world was structured, the social world was structured in accord with those categories and now conforms to those categories. Having spent a fair bit of time on the overlap between racial and age implicit bias, let me note a really important difference between them. And that has to do with the universality, but also the peculiar temporality, the peculiar time frame of prejudiced age beliefs. Universal, not literally. Some people tragically die young, but please note that this is one category of discrimination that we all hope ultimately to fall victim to. We all presumably want to live complete lifespans and eventually enter the category that many of us have prejudice attitudes against, right? And the fact that the stereotypes take hold when we are 1 year old, 3 year old, 5 years old, 10 years old, 20 years old, 30 years old, 40 years old, right? And please note that for many of us, right, in those age groups, one way to emphasize our own positive self-conceptions as vigorous, as productive, as sharp, and especially as autonomous and independent is to contrast ourselves with others who we view as less independent, etc. Right? And that the function in early life of implicit and explicit bias against people in their elderhood is in part self-enhancement, right? And this is the way many prejudices operate. But unlike race prejudice, right, where the victims, African Americans, for instance, will have developed a whole cultural repertoire, a whole deep well of cultural reserves for resisting the internalization of the prejudice and combating its effects, and start treating and teaching their children from a very young age exactly not to internalize and then discriminate against yourself, not to embody the stereotype. With the old age stereotype, it can become deeply internalized before it becomes self-relevant or self-referential, right? And so we are implicitly discriminating against our future selves, but at a point in life where, in a sense, it enhances in some ways our self-respect and self-esteem. But then, having deeply internalized it, it comes back to bite us, right? Once it's no longer the future self, but the present self. Once it's no longer enhancing, but undermining self-respect and self-esteem, the age bias has set in so deeply, and the habits of self-repair are not there, right? That it makes it very difficult to overcome. And I'll return to this a little bit later, but I think this is really important to see. If we're going to overcome ageism, part of what we're going to have to do is to convince younger people that they should not discriminate against their future self, and that there's a self-interested as well as a justice-based or other-oriented reason not to discriminate against your future self, right? So with all of that background in mind, let me turn to the actual content of Levy's theory. And this is what she calls SET, for stereotype embodiment theory. And a simple description of this is that negative age beliefs bring about detrimental health effects that are often and misleadingly characterized as the inevitable consequences of aging. right? So the fact that we've internalized these stereotypes and then come to inhabit the period of life to which they apply, and that they have been deeply internalized and are hard to resist, means that once we come to that stage of life via various pathways that we'll talk about in a moment, these beliefs become self-fulfilling prophecies, right? And she differentiates four different mechanisms here. The first mechanism is this internalization across the lifespan of the negative age beliefs. They are widespread, you might say ubiquitous in our culture. They are at first unresisted, that probably puts it too blandly, right? We spend the majority of our life not resisting them. And if we're only resisting them because they come to apply to us, it's only in, say, the last third of life that we begin to resist them. And they result in discrimination against an often segregated and marginalized population, right? And so we increasingly live in a culture in which the elderly are put in right facilities to one side of the other institutions in our culture. And although I have to admit, given the age of our current political leadership, calling the elderly marginal might be too strong. Um, the idea that in many workplaces, in many social contexts, the elderly are not necessarily present or in powerful or leadership positions, and so are not able to advocate for themselves in a sufficiently empowered way. The second mechanism or process that Levy directs our attention to is that these beliefs often unconscious in their operation. And the work that she does to detect their presence and to be able to measure whether or not people have these beliefs um, is work that attempts to detect the unconscious presence of belief and to determine whether or not it is also consciously reflected. And one of the things she finds is that conscious beliefs about aging are, generally speaking, independent from unconscious beliefs about aging. Something similar is often true with regards to race. Many white liberals, but also African Americans, say that they are not afraid of Black men. But then you put the electrodes on their skulls, you put the sensors on their body, and you expose them for fractions, milliseconds to Black faces, and they have a fear response, right? Similarly, when Becca Levy does similar experiments, she discovers that people who claim not to have ageist beliefs, in fact, do manifest ageism subconsciously. Um, Third mechanism here is that these age stereotypes are self-relevant, right? And so with racial prejudice, obviously it is self-relevant to African Americans, right? And one of the things we see is in interactions with police officers that African American men very often have a fear response, even if they've done absolutely nothing wrong, because they know that the police officer is having a fear response to them, right? And similarly, Claude Steele's work has shown that when a group of people has a negative stereotype about their performance in some context, and then a test or other high stakes performance that is relevant to that stereotype occurs, the fact that they think that they're being stereotyped undermines their capacity to do well in that environment, Claude Steele thinks that most of the test score gap on things like SATs in the United States with regards to race can be accounted for in this way, right? And when it comes to age, we all, in a sense, age into self stereotyping. And in the same way that a stereotype can get inside your head and undermine your capacity to avoid going into the fight or flight response when threatened, or undermining your capacity to do well in a test, the age stereotype can, in various ways, undermine your capacity to continue to have the full range of capabilities of younger people as you get older. And this gets us then into the fourth mechanism, which identifies three specific pathways through which age beliefs get under our skin. One of them is psychological, and she refers to low self esteem as one typical outcome of having negative age beliefs, and points out that without high self esteem, you have little will or confidence in many other of your life projects. And one of the studies that she looks at has to do with will to live and longevity. And they're simple but statistically robust illustrations of this. Christians tend to not have typical mortality rates in the build up to Christmas and the build up to Easter, right? People hang on for those holidays, make them through it, and then the mortality rates actually spike. Jews, something similar with the high holidays and Passover. I'm put in mind of Mark Twain, who, right, Samuel Clemens was born when Halley's Comet was overhead, and he wanted to live to see it as a mature man, and he did, and then he almost immediately died, right? So this idea that will to live is an expression of the more general psychological mechanism here. Having self-respect, self-confidence, self-esteem is essential to being active and engaged on a whole range of pursuits. If we internalize a stereotype that says you're incapable of all that stuff once you reach a certain age threshold, then that becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. A second pathway is behavioral. And here the idea is that negative age beliefs lead to unhealthy behaviors. And a clear example here is exercising, right? I'm too old for that. The examples that Levy offers in her book are really quite striking. She introduces us. She has a lot of these character sketches, and I don't want to suggest this is typical by any stretch of the imagination, but it is illuminating, at least, of what people can do if not inhibited by negative age beliefs. She introduces us to an 80-year-old woman who starts competing in triathlons, right? And not like miniature triathlons, a full marathon, a full 3-mile swim, a full 100-mile bike ride. And turns out she likes it. And she keeps doing it for another 10 years, right? Into her early 90s. She introduces us to a woman who, during COVID, is not allowed to swim in her public pool that she's been swimming in her whole life. But the person explains to her that only competitive swimmers can swim in it. The woman is 90 years old. She takes up competitive swimming in her 90s and starts winning races, right? And so all of this to say that it is very much a matter of belief for many people. Most of us are not going to start doing triathletes in our 80s or competitive swimming in our 90s, but we can continue to exercise. We can continue to be fit. Another simple example here is seeking medical help. If you just think, well, of course, I'm supposed to be old and creaky and not feel very well, then you're not going to perhaps seek out medical attention for an ailment that you would have earlier sought attention for. And the result of not seeking medical attention, not exercising, is that your health worsens. And then you get a reinforcement of that original negative belief. You're on a downward spiral. The third mechanism, and I think really the one that is has the deepest practical implications, maybe that's putting it too strongly, but the one I certainly found most startling and illuminating is a biological mechanism. And so to the simple clinical description of this is that negative age beliefs increase biomarkers of stress. And so cortisol is one that we've talked about many times before, part of the glucocortisol system, the adrenal stress system. Um, and CRP, which is a protein marker of inflammation. Um, and we'll get into this in greater detail in a minute. In a minute, but the idea that negative age beliefs actually produce biological changes in the body in older populations, and these lead to earlier health problems, not just physical, but also mental health problems, including memory loss and dementia, and then death, right? And so, right, this is, and this is, I think, where I'll start noting why Becca Levy is a professor of epidemiology in Yale's public health school, because she's interested in implicit age bias directed against the self, stereotype embodiment, and self embodiment as productive of negative health outcomes. And she believes, and I believe her evidence is quite sound, that we are suffering from an epidemic of this. So now let me say a little bit about the range and kind of experiments she does, the evidence she's gathered to support her theory. She starts by identifying behavior and psychological processes via which age beliefs affect health, right? And that's what we were just talking about. She then conducts studies in laboratories to try to isolate whether implicitly triggering self-relevant age beliefs, negative or positive, have immediately observable or long-term observable effects on different populations, right? She has a control population if she doesn't expose to the negative or the positive belief, and that she has a target population that she does, and she sees what the differences are between the populations. But she has also done, I think, some very creative, some very important revisiting of older medical data sets, as well as constructing new large population studies where you study 10,000 people at a time, you get a baseline of their age related attitudes, and then you try to get a whole bunch of other health data about them so as to be able to isolate those factors, your genetic factors, your lifestyle factors, your dietary factors, your underlying health conditions, to see how much of a difference the age related beliefs are making in various health outcomes across large populations in the real world. These are called, right, longitudinal studies, because they track people over 10, 20, 30, 40 years. She's done work on memory and functional health, on dementia and Alzheimer's, on overall longevity, on sensory functionality and creativity. I'm going to get into each of those for a moment to just show you some of the more striking results. I did put a single quotation here with her dementia Alzheimer's work, which I find to be the most striking. She says, among participants who carried the risky, I'm sorry, APOE or ApoE4 gene, and very quickly, you may be aware of this. There is a genetic predisposition to Alzheimer's, right? It's an allele. It's a uh, portion of your DNA, and if you have ApoE2, you're actually less disposed to have incidents of Alzheimer's. If you have E4, you're considerably more likely. You have a genetic predisposition to Alzheimer's. She finds that those with positive age beliefs were 40% less, should be likely, sorry, to develop dementia than those with negative age beliefs, right? And so that's nearly a 50% difference among the same genetically predisposed population. And we'll see this. Let's go ahead and get into it. But these are just striking results. So the first result is a lab based, and she did this also out in the real world kind of experiment where she exposes people to positive age beliefs. Some of this is subliminal, so an unconscious exposure to positive words associated with aging for milliseconds, for a total of 10 minutes a week, right? Um, and some of it is more explicit, getting people to do self affirmations about having positive associations with aging 10 minutes a week. And she measures their physical functioning. This has all kinds of things: grip strength, balance, stride length, walking speed, volume of air that you can consume. And you can see the results, right? Which is after 5 weeks, the people who have the positive age association are improving by about 50% over where they started. After 6 weeks, they're improving almost 100%. After 8 weeks, almost 200%. And there's a question, obviously, about how sustainable these results are, but it does appear to lend credence to the idea that the age beliefs can be changed, and when they're changed, it actually changes physical functionality. This is the ApoE4 predisposition genetically to Alzheimer's test results, right? And so she compares people who have the genetic predisposition, but positive age beliefs and negative age beliefs. And as you can see, the likelihood of developing Alzheimer's, if you have negative age beliefs, is almost twice what it is if you have positive age beliefs. And that despite, right, having the genetic predisposition to it. And to be as clear as possible, without getting fully into details I don't have a great handle on, there's this emerging field, I guess it's pretty well established at this point, of epigenetics, which looks at the way in which genetic predisposition is or isn't triggered environmentally in the individual, right? And so not everything that we're genetically predisposed to get actually comes to fruition. Part of that has to do with the environment. And what Levy is suggesting is that a really critical component of your environment, in terms at least of susceptibility to Alzheimer's, is your own beliefs about yourself and your aging process. And so I want you also to notice, right? This is people in the general population without the ApoE4, right, genetic predisposition. And please note that the people who are genetically predisposed to uh, have Alzheimer's later in life, but have positive age beliefs, are actually considerably less likely to actually develop Alzheimer's than the people without the genetic predisposition, but with negative age beliefs. A couple other results that I think this is really important and illuminating research that Levy is doing. Um, this is cortisol measurement, and this is her going back and looking at data from another long-term study, so she gets to see this over 30 years. This is a study where they measure their population every 5 years, and they measured them at the outset for age-related beliefs, and then they measured them every 5 years for cortisol level, right? Big stress hormone, one of the major pathogens or things that make us sick in the human body. We know from Daniel Levitin that high cortisol levels actually leads to rapid aging of the hippocampus in the brain, which is the one of the key circuits in memory formation and memory retrieval. And what you can see is that the people with negative age beliefs and the people with positive age beliefs are on opposite trajectories as they age with regards to their cortisol levels. The people with negative age beliefs, each 5 years, their cortisol level goes up, and it's more than double after 30 years what it was at the beginning of the study, even though it was a little lower than the people with positive age beliefs at the beginning of the study. The people with positive age beliefs, their cortisol level goes down by about 20% overall over the 30-year course of the study, right? And so again, I think a quite striking finding. Here's the one that really made Levy famous and actually got her invited to testify to Congress on hearings on ageism. Um, she did her own study over the course of about 20 years, 22 years, um, in which she took into account all kinds of genetic, family history, lifestyle, dietary, and disease related predictors of longevity, and isolated all of them in order to be able to focus on negative age and positive age beliefs. And what she found is that, right, percent still alive, years since initial interview, that those with negative age beliefs were living on average 7.5 years less than those with positive age beliefs once all the other variables were controlled for, right? And so it said this got her interviewed on, I think it was Good Morning America, but also by the Senate. This was a result that attracted a lot of attention, that simply having positive age beliefs could increase your lifespan by 7.5 years. And I think if you put these two diagrams together, in a sense, one way to read them is to say not only do positive age beliefs increase your lifespan, they also increase your health span. In other words, they don't just increase the quantity, but also the quality of years you get to spend on this planet. Final piece of data here, and then a little bit of thinking about the broader context. This has to do with heart problems, right? And again, she does these complicated battery of tests to try to control for all the other independent variables, and then isolate the effect of negative and positive age beliefs. And as you can see, right, much higher incidence, right? Nearly 3 times as high an incidence of um, heart problems and heart disease for people who have negative age stereotypes as opposed to people who have positive age beliefs. And so this leads to the idea that we have a silent epidemic um, that is, in important respects, different from other forms of prejudice. An epidemic because it is prevalent, you could say ubiquitous in our society. It is something that most of us are unself conscious about. I've pointed out to you, it's pretty easy if you go through the news, if you go through the newspaper, the nightly news, your television programming, to find the kind of age stereotyping and negative age beliefs that frankly nobody would tolerate with regards to race or sex anymore, right? And um, an epidemic in the sense not only that it is widespread and damaging, but that it is producing negative health results that are extremely costly in terms of individual well being and also in terms of social expenditures. And she points out that if we were to look for the roots of ageism, we would find them everywhere, right? That there's a nearly ubiquitous cumulative reinforcement of ageism in contemporary American culture. She points out that this was not always the case, and she draws on some other scholar studies and does some um, word association searches using Google to compare the terms associated with age and old and elderly 100 or more years ago and the words associated with them today, and finds essentially in the middle to late 19th century there was much less ageism or age prejudice than there is by the time you get to the second half of the 20th century. Um, the argument that this fills a psychological need, the self enhancement bias of the young, that we've become much more a youth culture, that this probably has a lot to do with consumer capitalism. And right, that's a 20th century development. The idea that we always need something new sends an implicit message about the value of something old, right? We have been marketed to along these lines for about 100 years now, and it is shaping our culture. She points out that in cartoons, fairy tales, and children's songs, there's old ladies, there's old men, there's old witches, and they're almost always figured as scary or stubborn or decrepit, right? And so that it's taking hold in what seems like this innocent way from a very young age. She notes in studies of curricula and the actual way in which schools are structured. She looks at media and popular culture for positive and negative age beliefs and finds that there's a vast preponderance of the negative age beliefs and stereotypes in our media. She notes that most workplaces have formal or informal retirement requirements, and that the association of productivity with youth and middle age and lack of accomplishment or relevance with being older is strongly reinforced in the workplace. She points out that medicine so often confounds age with illness, pathology, and decline, actually citing to Louise Aronson's work on this. And then this is something that we've noted when we were talking about Ellen Langer's work, and we'll come back to in the future. We have a built social world, right? How kitchens are organized, how many stairs there are in houses, how public spaces are organized. I try to take Bart from the airport to the city or the East Bay. And boy, when I'm coming from the airport with luggage or going to the airport with luggage, it's a struggle, right? Because so many stations don't have active elevators, because the escalators sometimes are also out of service and hard to use. And this is just an indication of the way in which our world is built for a certain level of capability as opposed to universal access, and how that leads then to people who don't have that level of physical ability withdrawing from those portions of the world that are not structured to be accessible to them. And again, that then reinforces that idea about the world. I think yeah, it's a good point for me to take a break and open it up to questions and discussions. You guys have been giving me wide berth today, but Anne's already got her hand up. Go ahead, Anne. You're still muted, but I think you know how to unmute yourself.
Got it. Two things came up early on, and one was cartoons, but you've mentioned that. The other one is that being old has changed in terms of what physical age that is, as the population in general has aged, has more older, and 60, 70 used to be old. It isn't anymore. Now we're talking about 90. But I think that part of it, and part of what may have kept a lid on some of this aging sensitivity, is that people don't live in multi-generational families anymore.
Yes.
And so they're not around their elders. And so they just don't have those experiences.
Yeah, I was reading a Philip Larkin poem about this topic, and I should say about this topic. The poem is called "Old Fools," to give you a sense of the tone. Larkin is often quite brutal and mean on these kinds of topics, and one of the lines in it is the generation that stopped caring for its elders, right? And so this idea that yes, for a lot of human history, including quite recently in our own history, your elderly parents lived with you and you took care of them, right? And it gave you both an opportunity to be involved with them, but also some knowledge and insight into what the aging process was like. So absolutely, this segregation of the aging of elders, I think, is extremely important. The other thing I was put in mind of, Anne, there's a community out here I go to, and I was talking with them about similar themes. And I was talking about people in their 70s and their 80s. And a woman I've known for about a decade raises her hand in the back, and I said, yes. And she says, you realize when you're talking about people in the 70s and 80s, you're talking about my children, not about me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
She's 98.
Yeah. But that's actually a very good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anybody else with a thought or a comment for today? Ruth,
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Well, actually, it's not really true that America had tradition of people living together. Americans moved across the country and often didn't do it with their parents. And other cultures within America, Asian or Hispanic, had much more a tradition of that. And when Social Security came and people had enough money to leave, they left the houses. Older people left because it wasn't necessarily a wonderful situation. They were there because they were poor and didn't have any money. So I think that's a kind of a myth that we really have to, think about, that this whole thing of people used to live together is not really true.
And Ruth, I want to say a couple different things here, and so we have to be careful with our generalizations in both directions, right? And so I think it was more common, and then we'd have to talk about for whom, when, where. But I think for a period in American history, for the family to be directly responsible for taking care of the elder relatives. Having said that, the next thing to notice is that people didn't live as long as frequently. So this was just a rarer thing, right? That gets back to that pyramid shaped demographic distribution as opposed to now the rectangular shaped demographic distribution. My grandfather said to me, "I can't believe I'm 80" when he got to be 80, right? And he was one of the very few people in his circle that made it to that age. The third thing I want to emphasize, and this I think is really important, right? We are a nation of immigrants. We're and we can begin to talk about the cultural history, which is really a topic for another day. But among other things, that means is that we're all descended from people, I shouldn't say all, but almost all of us descended from people who uprooted themselves or were uprooted from those stable communities of kinship and came over here and made a life for themselves. And so the fact that we are, as a result, a much less culturally homogenous community, but also a self-selected, in many respects, community of people who uprooted themselves and then remade a life, I think does make it less true in America than it is in many other societies, that we've got this long-standing tradition of kinship networks taking care of the elderly. So thank you. And go ahead, Ruth. Yeah.
I just wanted to add that there are a lot of people taking care of their elders now, and maybe more than ever before, because people are living longer. And as you pointed out, there are two generations that used to be considered old, and a lot of people in the 60s and 70s are taking care of their parents. And I think that should be acknowledged, that it's not like we've stopped caring.
Yes, and this is actually a trend now in the opposite direction. So I've looked at the data here a little bit, and we were moving in the direction of less home-based care in the last 2 decades of the 20th century, and it looks like we're moving back in the direction of more home-based care in the first couple decades of the 21st century. Okay, so I have 3 people with their hands up. Jeanette, why don't you go ahead? You're still muted. You have to. There you go.
I think the other thing, particularly as far as elders living with their children, is the fact that women are going to work. My grandfather lived with us, but my mother was home. And if she had, he did not need a lot of care, but he needed somebody in the household. And so I think a lot of the lack of people in the same household as their children is that the woman is working and there's no one to care for them.
Yes, and we're going to get into this more systematically next week. This has been kind of a Faustian bargain for many women, in the sense that they get out into the workforce in part because they want to, in part because they have to, because it's really hard to sustain a family on a single income in 21st century America. But the result is they end up paying other people to do some of the care labor they were doing themselves before, right? David, go ahead.
What I wanted to say was that it's a complicated situation on the issue of ageism. And we have to, I think, acknowledge the fact that even we as folks in their 80s and 90s and even into our hundreds perpetuate some of the stereotypes. It's captured in the humor. We love the humor about old people. And we often share these jokes and the like. And I'm in there with everyone else. But I think it's because laughing at oneself has an element of volition in it, whereas laughing at others doesn't. And so when it's imposed from another group who hasn't, if you will, earned the right to laugh at themselves, then I think it can become problematic. But what I really wanted to say was that these comparisons across time are always difficult, and as you and Ruth have both alluded to, physical age is confounded with relative age in a society. And the question is an 85-year-old in today's world comparable on an intellectual and sort of physical health basis to a 65-year-old 80 or 100 years ago? And until we can get that confounding out of the comparisons, I think these comparisons over time are fraught with vulnerability to misinterpretations and the like. So, and the last thing I want to say is that it's a matter of balancing independence and care. And one of the reasons that we all moved to a place like Piedmont Gardens is so that we can have our independence on the things that matter most to us and be openly dependent upon some other things like cooking and fundamental healthcare issues and stuff like that. So it's really a matter of making choices, I think. And independence is variable depending upon what part of our lives we're talking about.
Yeah, I was a little bit sick last week. I was more than a little bit sick. And we had a big snowstorm, not a big snowstorm, but by standards of the winter of 2023, a big snowstorm. And damn it, I still had to go out there, cold and sick as I was, and shovel the stairs and the walkway, because if I didn't, somebody was going to trip and fall. And certainly there are aspects of that. The older you get, probably the less you want. Although I had neighbors in New Hampshire in their 80s still shoveling their long walkway when I was up there. So it varies as well. And I think they just viewed that as part of the way they maintain themselves. But yes, I think all of those are good points, and confounding our comparisons, but also just a really good thing to bear in mind, right? You see all these people, 80 is the new 70 or 80 is the new 60, right? The idea that between advances in healthcare, advances in nutrition, lifestyle, treatment of certain diseases, we are not just living longer, our health span is longer as well, right? And so many of the ways in which we accommodated the smaller population of people who lived to those ages 50 years ago, just really, it's incommensurate with what we have to do today. So thank you, David. Good points. Bob, thank you for waiting patiently. Why don't you take us away today?
Just 2 points. One quickly, I hope. It sounds like an argument for raising the eligibility age for Social Security to 70. And then secondly, on a practical basis, okay, we've all grown up with all these biases built in and learned. How do we reverse them? I mean, here we are. I would love to be able to say, okay, I got a much better outlook on life, but I'm not so sure how I'm going to be able to get rid of all that stuff that is accumulated over the years.
Yeah, so I want to say be careful what you wish for with Social Security eligibility, not because I don't think that taking into account that people are staying healthy longer and capable of working longer, that it might be better for them to work longer. But then you also have to address workplace discrimination, right? And the fact that for many people, the Social Security benefits are inadequate to cover the cost of living, right? So if you can push the eligibility back, address the workplace discrimination, and increase the generosity of the benefits to keep up with the cost of living, then I think you've got a package that might work together.
Well, I understand. I'm not pushing for that. I'm just
Yeah.
noting that maybe what you're saying or what the research is saying is a supporting argument.
And the second
well
point,
beyond that.
Second point again, Bob, real quickly.
It's a practical point of, okay, throughout my life, I've had all of these biases, inundated by all of these biases. How do I reverse that?
So the first thing I'm going to say, and I'll let me preface it with a little bit of background. I grew up in Northern California. I grew up in probably the height of the self-help era, and being a good rebellious kid, I rejected all of that as a bunch of healy-feely nonsense when I was a young man. And it turns out that there was probably some validity to that stuff, and that a fair bit of what Langer's research shows is self-affirmation helps. But let me, because I cut this short, go to one last slide for you today, and I promise I'll be brief, and we can return to this later. But this is her basic method, and there's like a 6-page appendix in her book with exercises. I can try to get that to Amy, and she can share it with you, or to suggest that she make the book available in the library. But the 3 key ideas, A, B, C, right? She figures a clever mnemonic here. Increase awareness, right? So just be alert to the the kind of self-deprecating humor David was talking about. Maybe that's not quite as innocent as we think it is, right? Maybe that's contributing to self-stereotyping. Our culture does this to us so ubiquitously. When is the culture doing it to us? Start pointing at the TV and telling it to stop doing that, right? And then, second of all, there's a whole chapter, An Anatomy of a Senior Moment, in which she points out that often what we beat ourselves up over in terms of losing the keys of the cell phone, or not remembering what you went from one room to the other to do, happens to us just as frequently when we're younger, but we don't beat ourselves up over it because we haven't stereotyped ourselves as being forgetful because we're elderly. So recognize that rather than blaming yourself, blame ageism. Rather than blaming aging, blame ageism for those aspects of it that you detect having internalized and then having behavioral impacts on you. And then third, and this really comes to what you're saying there, Bob, is challenge negative age beliefs in yourself explicitly, right? Once you're aware of them, say, I've got to stop doing that, but also implicitly through self-affirmation and other exercises in rearranging the unconscious categorical furniture of the mind, right? And this is where the self-help stuff, the affirmations come in, right? And one of the things she has experimented with is 10 minutes a week of saying, I'm 80, but I'm still capable. I'm 80, but I'm still strong. I'm 90, but I still have my wits about me. I'm 100, but I can still play the violin. Just focusing on the stuff that you have maintained, that you are happy with, and using that to reset your implicit self-conception. She finds that that's actually helpful. The final point on that screen, I'm not going to go back to it. I wasn't really intending to cover it all right now, is that all of that stuff at the level of the individual works to a certain degree, but it doesn't fully work unless we're also making social changes at the same time. So that's a kind of planter for a future conversation. Okay.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Thank you for the good questions. Take care, everybody. Good being with you as always. I will see you next Saturday. Thanks, everybody. Have good remainders of the weekend. Bye-bye.